We're continuing on with the Alpha series. Pastor Tim launched it off last week, and it's a 16-week thing, and it's really awesome. So tonight, the question is going to be about who is Jesus? So, I grew up in church and didn't really know any different. And we were in a Pentecostal holiness church during the fire and brimstone age, and it was just turn or burn, and they tried to scare you out of hell and scare you into heaven, and everything you did, you were going to burn in hell for. So, they were really hard on the kids, trying to keep them from doing things that just kids will naturally do, and I was one of those kids that tested those boundaries and naturally did a lot of stuff. And I was kind of told that some of the things I had started to do, I was going to be going to hell for. And I kind of just believed that. I'm like, well, what does it matter then? If I've already gone too far, then what does it matter? And then I also thought to myself, like, I haven't really seen any real evidence. Like, what you just want me to accept and believe what you're saying. And, there were people being healed and there were miracles, but as a younger kid, I wasn't really sure. I wasn't sure if you waited 3 days that the cold would go away anyway. I didn't have an evidence that Jesus was real. So tonight we're going to be asking the question again, what evidence is there for Christianity? You can prove Christianity mathematically. You can prove it scientifically. Of course, science is very important, but science answers different questions of faith. Science answers the questions, when and how did this world come to be? What it can't answer is the question of who and what. So suppose I have a cheesecake here. And if I sent this cheesecake to some scientists, they may, got a little early there. Suppose that I sent this to the scientists, they would be able to see what the ingredients are. They would be able to tell you how it was made. They would probably be able to tell you when it was made, but they wouldn't be able to tell you why it was made or who made it. Only the Creator can tell you who and why something was made. So actually, I made this cake, and I actually just made the heart of this cake for Valentine's Day for Moose, which if anybody doesn't know, that's Pastor Tracy. That's what I call her. That's a long story. You guys can see that, hear about it later. So that's the difference between science and faith. Science is very important because it deals with the scientific questions. But faith is really important because it answers some of the very fundamental questions about life. And everyone has faith. The atheist has faith that there is no God. You can prove that mathematically or scientifically. You can't prove that mathematically or scientifically. And those of who believe in Jesus do so on the basis of faith. I believe there's good historical evidence. Historical evidence is evidence. Scientific evidence is not the only kind of evidence. A lawyer uses what is called historical evidence. Every time a jury brings back a verdict, they're doing it based on the things that have happened in history. And every jury decision is a leap of faith. We have to make up our minds about Jesus, and that is going to be a leap of faith. It seems to me that the resurrection of Jesus strongly suggests that there would be a creator for the world. And that the creator is to be seen through the lens of Jesus Christ. You can't get to know someone unless someone reveals himself. And if there's a God and he wanted to reveal himself to us, it seems logical that he would reveal himself in a way that we could understand as a human being like us. So, what is the evidence? Some people say maybe Jesus didn't even exist. We know from the evidence outside the New Testament that Jesus existed from historians like Tacitus and Suetonius. I've tried to practice those words and stumbled anyway. The first, you're supposed to say it really fast and just, really assertive, and everybody's like, oh, that's how you say that. I didn't know that. I've been saying it wrong all the time, but I didn't smooth right through that. The first century Jewish historian Josephus wrote this about Jesus. There was a time when Jesus, a doer of wonderful works. So there's evidence outside the New Testament, but most of our evidence comes from inside the New Testament. People say, how do we know that it has been changed? How do we know that it hasn't been changed over the years? We know through science called textual criticism. The way textual criticism works is like this. The more manuscripts that you have and the earlier they are, the more you can be sure about what the original said. Herodias and Thucydides were both written in the 5th century BC. The earliest copies we have are 90 AD. So there's 1,300 year gap, and we have only 8 copies of those. Levi's Romans history, 900 year gap, has only 20 copies. Caesar's Gallic War, 950 year gap, 9 to 10 copies. Tacitus, 1,000 year gap, 20 copies. Then we come to the New Testament, written between 40 and 100 AD. The earliest manuscripts is 130 AD. 5,309 Greek manuscripts, 10,000 Latin, and 9,300 others. The textual critic F.J. Hart said this: in the variety and fullness of the evidence in which it rests, the text of the New Testament stands absolutely and unapproachably alone amongst ancient writing styles. So we know from the evidence inside and outside the New Testament that Jesus existed. But who is he? But who is he? We know he was fully human. He had a body, emotions, and experiences. We know he existed. Maybe he was a great human being. Maybe he was a great religious teacher, but not much more than that. To suggest he was the Son of God or to suggest he's God, now that's going too far. So, there are 2 parts to this argument. The first part of the argument is, what did Jesus think about himself? Because if Jesus didn't think that he was God, then that's kind of the end of the argument, isn't it? And even at the end of the second part of the argument, excuse me, was he right? Point 1, what did Jesus say about himself? The first bit of evidence here is that Jesus' teaching was centered on himself. Great religious teachers point away from themselves. They say, don't look at me, look at God. Jesus, who is the example of being humble, said, look at me, come to me. The question, what is our life about, is a sense of a spiritual hunger. The sense that stuff can't satisfy, no matter how good these things are. There's always something off. The sense that something is missing. Jesus said, I am the bread of life. He was saying, if you want hunger satisfied, come to me. There's stuff in our lives that paralyze us. Jesus said, the Son sets you free, you are free indeed. Then there's all the stuff that we carry around, worry, anxiety, guilt, doubt. Jesus said, come to me, you who are all weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. He was saying, if you want peace, come to me. Jesus said, if you receive me, you receive God. He was saying, if you welcome me, you've welcomed God. There was a little child drawing a picture of God in a class one day. The teacher said, what are you doing? The child said, I'm drawing a picture of God. The teacher said, what do you mean? You can't draw a picture of God. Nobody knows what God looks like. And the child said, well, they will in a minute. Jesus said, if you want to know what God looks like, look at me, and you have seen him. And then there was where his indirect, and then there were his indirect claims. Jesus claimed to be able to forgive sins. He went up to people and said, "Your sins are forgiven." So if someone offends you, sure, you can forgive them, but you can't go up to some random person and say, "Your sins are forgiven." When Jesus did that, the scribes said, "Who can forgive sins but God alone?" Forgiveness is what Jesus came to do, and he came to make forgiveness possible. C.S. Lewis says, "A Christian is someone who forgives the inexcusable because God has forgiven the inexcusable in us." And then there were his direct claims. There are so many of them. John 3:10-30-33, Jesus says, "I and the Father are one." Once again, the people picked up stones to kill him. Jesus said, "At my Father's direction, I have done many good works. For which are you going to stone me?" And they replied, "We're stoning you not for any good works, but for blasphemy. You are a mere man claiming to be God." I think if you look at all the evidence, it's clear that Jesus did what he claimed. It's a claim that needs to be tested, though. There are only three possibilities. Either it was not true and Jesus knew perfectly well it was not true, in which case he was a liar, or else it was not true and he simply didn't realize it was not true. He genuinely thought he was God, in which case he was crazy or insane. Logically, there's only one other possibility, and that is that it's true. C.S. Lewis says, "A man who was merely a man and said the sort of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He'd either be insane or else he'd be the devil of hell." Point two, what evidence is there to support his claims? So the second part of the argument is, was he right in what he said about himself? The first piece of evidence in his teaching is his teachings. Jesus taught to love your neighbor as yourself, to do unto others as you would have done unto you. And out of nowhere, Jesus was the first person to say this: love your enemies. I love a lot of people back in the day. Now I don't have any enemies. I've loved them all. Jesus' teachings have been the foundation of our country. Many of our laws were originally founded on the teachings of Jesus. We've advanced in every field and science and technology. Think how much we've advanced in the last 10 years. Yet 2,000 years, no one has ever improved on the moral teachings of Jesus. They are the greatest words spoken. They are the kind of words you would expect God to speak. So, the first piece of evidence is his teachings. Secondly, his life and what he did. See, I thought Christianity was kind of lame. I didn't think Jesus would be very cool. I thought Jesus would be the kind of person that would turn wine into water, not water into wine. Not just his miracles, but his love for the disregarded, feeding the hungry, healing the sick, and ultimately laying down his life for us. Jesus said, "Greater love has no one than this, that laid down his life for his friends." Time magazine described Jesus as the most persistent symbol of purity, selflessness, and love in the history of humanity. The real test of character is when we're under pressure. And when Jesus was being tortured, he said this: "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." And then his fulfillment of prophecy. No one else in the world has had a whole collection of books written about them before they were even born. Jesus fulfilled 3,000 prophecies, 29 of them in one day. Some will say he got a hold of the Old Testament. He heard all these prophecies and he decided he'd better go around fulfilling all of them. The problem about that is the sheer number of them, and humanly speaking, he had no control over any of them. The exact manner of his death was prophesied, the place of his burial, his resurrection, and even the place of his birth was prophesied. How do you fake that? And then his victory over death. This is the cornerstone of Christianity. It is so relevant to every single person here because statistically speaking, 1 in 1 die. We will all die. We don't like to talk about death. It's kind of just something we don't mention. But people die nonetheless. And when you go to a funeral and the coffin goes into the ground, it looks pretty final. And it is unless death and the grave have been defeated and Jesus is raised to life. If he was, then there is hope for us in the afterlife. But is it just wishful thinking? It is unless there's evidence. What is the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus? First of all, his absence in the tomb. No one has ever satisfactorily explained why Jesus' body was not there on the first Easter Sunday. People have come up with all sorts of explanations, like the authorities stole the body. Is that the case? Why didn't they produce the body when everyone was saying that they had seen Jesus? Because they couldn't. When the disciples heard that Jesus had been raised from the dead, and they ran to the tomb, and when they got to the tomb, they looked in, and what they found was Jesus' clothes. The only thing worth stealing was still in there. Plus the people around had heard, plus the piece around his head had been folded up and put into another place. And it says when they saw that, they believed. So not only his absence from the tomb and his presence with the disciples, Jesus had been seen several other times. One time by more than 500 people. That's probably the number of people in here tonight. We're pretty packed out, which is pretty awesome for baptism night. High-strung, then some people might say that it was a hallucination. High-strung, highly imaginative, very nervous people, or people who are sick, or people who are on drugs are the ones who have hallucinations. The disciples were fishermen, tax collectors, and doubters like Thomas. They didn't have hallucinations in what they saw. Most of the disciples died really horrific deaths as a result of their beliefs. They were crucified, they were beheaded, and they were tortured. All they had to say was, no, it's not true. We didn't really see him, but they didn't. They knew it was true because they had seen Jesus in the flesh. You know, there's 2,300 million Christians in the world today, on every continent, of every nationality, of every economic, social, and intellectual background. They all have a testimony of when they met Jesus. So when you look at what Jesus claimed about himself, the first part of the argument, it is clear Jesus claimed to be a man whose identity was God. Was he crazy? Was he a liar? When I look at the evidence of his teachings and the teachings that he did, his character, his fulfillment of prophecy, and his resurrection, it's profound. It provides the strongest possible supporting evidence that Jesus said about himself it was true. When God showed me the evidence that he was real, I was behind a building ready to kill my family. It was the darkest place I'd ever been. And Tracy and I had just gone through some really hard stuff. I just found out that she had cheated on me, and it wasn't the first time, and I just was going to take us out, and I didn't want anybody to have to worry about us, and I didn't want my kids to have to worry about why I did or didn't do what I did, or, you know. And somehow I ended up in church, this church, 2 weeks later, listening to a message about marriage. And it happened 3 days before I got here. There was a card that came in the mail that said, "Marriage Matters." And then Tracy, she held it up and said, "Could God do anything to help us?" You know, like I said, I grew up in church and she didn't. And I thought, I don't know. I feel like he hasn't done anything, but here we are almost 2 weeks later, and somehow I didn't follow through with the thoughts I was having. So we came. And it's been almost 20 years that we've been coming here. And if you'd have told me that I'd be up here tonight 20 years ago, I probably wouldn't have came to church. But God knows what he's doing. You can't deny the evidence if you look for it. The evidence is there.